Thank you very much, Professor Pritchard. And I hope you don't mind my speaking, from this position rather than standing up there, because, well, let's put it this way. I'm not getting younger, and these little things become quite an ordeal after a time, As I was telling my friend, co-editor just now, Simon Gikandi, I'm beginning to understand the poetry of W.B. Yeats more and more, because the latter part of his poetry is precisely focused on the problems of aging. So thanks to the ASA for this invitation, to the President, outgoing and incoming Falola, is an old friend, from the University of Ife long ago. It came as a surprise, but a very welcome one, So my next tribute will be to Bashorun MKO Abiola in recognition of his gesture in endowing this lecture, and in fact, this is not the only thing endowed in Nigeria. He also there was an Abiola Prize for science writing many years ago. I'm not sure it's still in existence. Now, as it will become evident as I go along, Bashorun Abiola's gesture provides a point of reference for some of the reflections I propose to offer in this lecture. Many people have wondered if there is a family connection between him and me because of the name. I share a name with him. The confusion arises from that fact, which is really a coincidence, because in his case the name happens to be a family name, whereas in my case Abiola is my middle name, which has served for years as part of my professional identity. And it was in order to resolve the confusion that I added the initial letter of my Christian name, Francis, so I now use F. Abiola Irele. I just thought I would clear that and get it out of the way. Now, the third preliminary remarks I want to make will be in honor of Ali Mazrui. I have very, very vivid memories of him, right up to actually 2 years ago. And those memories go back to the mid-60s, when he was still writing for Raja Newji's Transition. The original journal, by the way, that is now being published, moved to Ghana, to Accra at one point, before it went to Harvard, and I edited it for 5 years, as you've just heard. Later in the 60s, I had occasion to discuss many of his articles in a comprehensive review in the Cambridge Journal of Modern African Studies, which was edited, by Kimball and his wife, And even to take him on, especially with regard to a very brilliant article he wrote, which is entitled Secret Suicide, but with which I disagree profoundly. And it might be interesting to go back and reread that essay today in the light of contemporary developments. I won't develop that. I won't go further. Now for an explanation of my title, African Studies as Discipline, that is as a structure of knowledge, and its orientation specifically in a changing world, in a tumultuous world. As you know, the world is always changing. We have, Achebe has a proverb about that. The world is a mask dancing, appropriate image, So certainly historical consciousness is characteristic, historical consciousness is part of the African heritage, despite all the arguments, against. And Achebe puts it in African terms, the form of a proverb, an image, that is the mask. As vocation, that's the second part of my lecture, I will come to it at the end. That is, as a form of commitment and the obligations it imposes on the African scholar. Let me begin with a preliminary view of the condition of African studies as a discipline and its implications for serious scholarship. Here I would like to recall an article by Olaniyan Tejumola, which appeared many years ago in Passages, which is House Journal of the Program for African Studies at Northwestern, or it used to be. I haven't seen it for a long time. I hope he's still alive. And, his objection, in that article he expressed an objection to what he sees as the undiscriminating banding together of various disciplines and specializations in the program at Northwestern and other centers and departments of African Studies, institutes, and so on, simply by reason of the fact that the scholarship that was pursued in these departments had to do primarily with Africa, His objection to this arrangement was based on what he saw as the disparities in method and even content, methodology and content, as they apply to the various disciplines concerned. It occurred to me at the time that this was an arrangement that historically was not unique to Africa, to African studies, since this was largely the model that prevailed in the departments of classics, where the intensive study of Latin and Greek laid the foundation for scholarship in literature, history, and philosophy as components of a single field of study concerned with the legacy of Greek and Roman civilization, which were then considered, of course, as a bedrock of the Western view of the world. The immediate problem, of course, here is debate as to whether African studies or Black studies or Africana studies was a discipline at all, at least a unified discipline. The question was not asked about classics, which is the originating model of area studies, and in fact the model has been adopted in the humanities across the board. In French, as French studies, literature, etc., French thought and so on. In English, cultural studies, especially as it was taught at the University of Birmingham, was a major component. Techumola's position also reminds me of the debate provoked by the plan to set up an Institute of African Studies at University College Ibadan, where I studied, and it is bearing on this debate on the place of African studies in an African university. This was in the 1950s, the late 50s, right up to, I left Ibadan in 1960, and the argument was still going on. The argument that was invoked at that time by some critics of the plan was that there was no need for a specific specialized institute or center, since an African university was by definition a comprehensive center of learning concerned with modes of life and expression on the African continent. And I understand that this debate has been revived recently in Ghana at this time. The question hinges on the definition and conception of African studies. It is evident from the historical record, as is evident from the historical record of its development and evolution. Indeed, this is a history that, as Eliza has shown in a remarkable survey published recently, a history that displays a remarkable coherence and bears an immediate relevance to our concerns as scholars. The point is that African studies and disciplines that relate to what we now recognize as a field are not recent creations. An emotional response to the historic and existential condition of the Black race fostered the intellectual engagement with Africa that came to provide the foundation for African studies, as a discipline. This process goes back to at least the late 19th century, with the work of Edward Wilmot Blyden, which represents a notable instance. The movement as it developed was sustained by Black intellectuals who were both scholars and activists. The eminent figure here is, of course, Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, whose PhD thesis, of course, focused on Africa, the suppression of the slave trade. And of course, he wrote other things, Black folk then and now, and of course, the souls of Black folk, all this track the course of his career. The tradition he initiated was consolidated by other figures such as Carter Woodson, in the miseducation of the Negro, by Zora Neale Hurston, and so many others, in work done with the encouragement of Franz Boas. People like Franklin Frazier, John Hope Franklin, Eliot Skinner, who was in fact a member of the African Studies Association right up to the time of his death, about a few years ago. He came to practically all the congresses. You saw him as a major figure, here. Let me just give you a quick quotation. Carter Woodson said, the point is that, of course, all this was an effort at rehabilitation of the race. The race has a past, and it did not begin on the cotton and sugar plantations. That's Carter Woodson, and that's very, very well put. So you have, despite the political and social meanings of black studies, the relation between black studies and African studies has often been an ambiguous one. Consortium's theory of the Black Atlantic to demonstrate the appropriation of Western rationality, specifically by Richard Wright and Du Bois. I believe this suggests a certain embarrassment on his part, a complex bred by the notion of an absence of ruins, what some of them call an absence of ruins with regard to Africa, So you have, it was left to Bernard Bailyn to restore Africa to the Atlantic, And in fact, I believe that the Atlantic studies that Bailyn inaugurated then began, of course, to, shall we say, inspire interest in the African connection to the Indian Ocean, a connection that is now likely, to develop with a new orientation towards China, a rediscovery, a new encounter with China, which has now become a major player, So, and all this is the background, and the context of what we all know as the Negritude movement, a reactivation of the African image, a rearticulation rather of the African image, which provides a context for the Negritude movement. For the work of Leopold Sédar Senghor and Sheikh Anta Diop and so on, particularly in the case of Senghor, for the elaboration in poetry and prose of what I've called elsewhere, echoing the Derrida, a metaphysics of difference. The Derrida speaks of metaphysics of presence. In the case of Senghor, it's a metaphysics of difference. So, and now this has a consequence for scholarship. In the late 60s and 70s, there was a huge, shall we say, development, a huge, shall we say, a huge output by African scholars. Much of this was devoted, in fact, to what might be called development studies. I want to strike the example, for instance, here of Mabo Gunje, who countered, Akim Mabo Gunje, who countered Rostam in terms of, the whole process of development. His book, in fact, was called The Development Process, rather than a development that was based on an external output and led to some kind of lift-off, Mabo Gunje argued for an internally centered mode of development, So, let me get back, now let me look at specifically the years that followed. The years that, may be called the age of anxiety. Because after all this period, of, enthusiastic scholarship and so on, and confident scholarship, we then had, of course, a period of crisis, And this, of course, reflected the situation in Africa itself, the politics, the instability, the rise of dictatorships, of military regimes, of ethnic strife, dysfunctional polities. Consequently of economic deprivation, all over Africa, the middle class was broken, and you have all the social upheavals, and this continues. Violence all over the continent. This continues. Ali Mazrui has summed this up he summed it up with the term "the African condition" in his famous Reed lectures, and it gave rise to what has been called Afro-pessimism. It is a French term, coined by Jean-François Bayard in his book L'État en Afrique, La politique du ventre, published in 1989. In East Africa, also there was a development of social studies. I should have said this earlier. I want to add this very quickly, and also in literature, specifically, in literature. So all the work done on oracy, orality, and so on. The term oracy was coined specifically in East Africa, culminating in the abolition of the English department at the University of Nairobi. Which has been documented by Apollo Amoko in a very interesting book. We did the same kind of thing at the University of Ibadan, in less dramatic terms. We did not abolish the English department, but we gave it a new orientation. The same thing also in the Department of Modern Languages, where I functioned at the time, where we introduced Francophone literature and so on. So, we have then, specifically in the African context, a certain reassertion, of what you might call an African personality in scholarship. Let me move on. So, I was talking earlier on then of the age of anxiety. I hope I have
plenty of time.
Plenty of time, very good. All that was evoked, that what I call the age of anxiety, was evoked by Goran Haydn in 1995, the ASA conference in Orlando. And it became a major theme in the literature of the New Realism, what I call the New Realism, from the mid-60s, and particularly the work of the French-speaking African writers, people like Sonny Labo Tansi, and Amadou Kourouma, Tierno, Unenembo, and so on and so forth. In the social sciences, you have the work of George Ayite, in Africa Betrayed is a specific title, very striking title. In the work of Achille Mbembe, who wrote a very, very searing article which was called De la Post-Colonie, and also very interesting essay which hasn't got enough publicity, in my view, African Modes of Self-Writing, with which I have some quarrel, a disagreement, but which, of course, was very pointed in its specific reference. Thus, African studies, as it affected African scholars, reflected the impact of events. Because we were faced, instead of structured societies, we were faced with instability. Hence, the call by Chris de Wert for what he calls an anthropology of discontinuity, using a postmodernist jargon, if you like. Chris de Wert asserts talks about moving from an African anthropology to an anthropology of Africa. The question here, why anthropology? Why not sociology? And this leads to another point, which is that of a certain internal crisis within the discipline itself in at least two respects. The first concerns the persistent image of African studies as a body of knowledge irrevocably bound to anthropology. Anthropology itself, was in fact defined by this connection. As introduction to Bates and the work by Bates, etc., et al., states, let me quote, "If a discipline could be said to possess a taproot, then research in Africa could be said to be a taproot of anthropology." Anthropology then became a model with its methodology, the so-called participation process endorsed by Jane Goyer. Let me quote her very quickly. "It can hardly be stated forcefully enough to those outside our field, that is of anthropology, that all the seminal work has been done by scholars who have been forced by long stay and consistent exposure to take on the originality of Africa in a profound and analytically critical way. It's in African studies in the United States. Okay, let me see. Anyway, the Malinowskian model, however, had been challenged, by even already in the 50s, not as late as the 80s, as Jean Goya affirms, had been challenged by Georges Ballandier in his introduction to his Sociologie actuelle de l'Afrique noire. The introduction became very, very well known in Francophone Africa. It's entitled quite simply La Situation Coloniale. Anthropology presents itself not only as a discipline with a place and function in the academy, but also as a genre of literature with a peculiar exotic appeal for a general public. Thus, you have the work of Margaret Mead. It's significant that Soyinka's novel, when it was reviewed in, I think, Time magazine or Newsweek, it was entitled, his biography was entitled Growing Up in Nigeria, by analogy with growing up in Samoa. But anthropology, implies alterity, the otherness of the other, the otherness of the other. So you have, that's the basis, in fact, of the critique by Kizebo in the UNESCO history, the opening, introduction, who also quotes many other people. Also Mudimbe, who calls it langage en folie. As Kofi Agawu observes, there is, I suggest, I'm quoting him, an unwillingness to lift the veil that enshrouds Africa, a fear that doing so might have a civilizing effect on the discourse of the West, thus depriving its practitioners of one of their most cherished sources of fantasy and imaginative play. It's an introduction to, in the Journal of American Musicology. The original association of African studies with anthropology and the scholarly consideration of non-Western societies, this was taken up by Samir Amin and Claude Ake, the late Claude Ake, with a challenging of global economic order and social sciences, and the social sciences that legitimize it. More recently, there is a problem specifically, another problem formulated by Kofi Agawu. No sociology of knowledge, and certainly not a sociology of knowledge about African music, can proceed very far without encountering the explicitly political. As Marshall Salins puts it, ethnography in the wake of colonialism can only contemplate the sadness of the tropics. Here we have an echo, of course, of Triste Tropique, what do you call him? So this was in the Journal of Modern History. So we recognize the dimension of history in cultural processes, even in the invention of traditions. And he makes the following observation. If the world is becoming a culture of cultures, then what needs to be studied is the indigenization of modernity through time and in all its dialectical ups and downs. Thus, he concludes, the days are over for an ethnography that was an archaeology of the living, searching under the disturbed topsoil of modernity for the traces of a pristine and primitive existence. Let me add to this a quotation from Carr. Carr writes, and this was already in 1962, in a book published in 1962, it is only today that it has become possible for the first time to imagine a whole world consisting of peoples who have, in the fullest sense, entered history and become the concern no longer of the colonial administrator or the anthropologist, but of the historian. I might add, who are able now to take charge of their own history. You see, I I wish I could go on to a conclusion. A first conclusion arises from what I've said so far. So it's not a question of recognition for African thought or philosophy or music or whatever, but a consideration for African peoples from object of discourse to the subject to be there. African peoples have become the subject of history of their own discourse. That's why I quoted Kant. I want to conclude now. I'm sure you are relieved that I won't go on and on and on. But I want to conclude very quickly. I was warned by this already. I was told that I should leave time for discussion, and I hope we'll have a fruitful discussion. Let me just add then to what I've said, that we have a new orientation, a new dimension emerging of African studies, as vocation. African studies can be said to constitute already some kind of structure of knowledge built up by non-Africans and being developed, expanded, refined even by Africans, African scholars, people like, I've named so many, I could name many others. So there are new areas, however, to be explored. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here. Particularly the area of science. I think, we haven't done enough in the sciences. There have been scientists at the University of Ibadan when I was a student there. The Department of Virology was very, very active, and it is still a major area of concern, Another area that we need to explore, well, many other areas of science, but one pressing area is that of the internet and digital processes and applications. It's interesting to observe that as a young woman who graduated from Harvard a few years ago, went out to East Africa and has just written a book which she calls The Bright Continent. And it describes the ways in which, the cell phone has been used, in East Africa in particular. The book is called The Bright Continent. I have not read the book. I read a long article in it in one of the American journals. A very important area is environment and public health. If anything reminds us of this at all, it is the virulence and of the Ebola emergency that we're going through, all over the continent. People say Nigeria has curtailed Ebola, maybe for now, but the conditions for the emergence of Ebola remain. You cannot be sure that it will not reappear. So I'm not particularly, shall we say, comforted. So we have, the area of public health. Now I want to touch finally really here on a major point, a major preoccupation, and that is our relation to foreign universities, organizations, specifically the foundations. It seems as if our governments, and you can quote me on this, that they are not fully conscious of the implications of what a university implies in our context, in terms specifically of funding, support, and so on. It seems as if for them a university is just a mere decoration. There are a few universities that have succeeded, but there is urgent need to impress on our governments. I'm thinking specifically of my own country, of the need to support the universities. The foundations are closing down. They're not particularly receptive to the demands, that we're making on them. And also, they're setting their own agendas. They've done very useful work, but we can't go on and on, relying on their own priorities instead of defining our priorities, carrying them out, and they may be, shall we say, they come in as a last resort. It looks as if, the whole idea now is that we should run to the foundations to support us. Luckily in Nigeria, there's a foundation a state foundation which is called the ETF. It's a sort of endowment fund for, I don't know, ETF stands for, can't even remember, we say TED fund rather, TED fund, but it's not functioning very well. I mean, there are all kinds of rules, sometimes arbitrary and so on. All these are issues that need to be examined. The main point I want to make, and on which I want to conclude, is that our universities have to be embraced by our governments, not seen as playthings, political objects. You get up, you found a university as a political gesture, as if you were making some kind of, as I said, a generous gift to a particular people. You do not get up and found 7 universities in one blow, in one fell swoop. You think about it, you plan it, So this is what I want to say. You can quote me as I say again. We need to make our governments, our institutions aware that universities are extremely important. They're central to any plan of development in Africa. Basically, then this is what I thought I should say. Thank you very much.